The Tethys generational med hubs came apart without a sound. That was the detail Subadjutant Vale would never stop turning over. Not the scale of it, not the numbers, but the silence. In the vacuum of the Jovian ring, 3 orbital stations that housed 1.8 million medical staff and patients simply folded inward, hull by hull, tier by tier, until the debris cloud settled into a slow, glittering rotation around nothing. No fire, no shockwave the audio feeds could carry. Just the visual, a thing existing, and then not existing, and the registry cameras dutifully recording both states. Grand Fleet Overseer Zyla Voss stood at the center of the Galactic Registry Chamber's primary broadcast lens and adjusted his adamantine command crest with 2 fingers. Not a dramatic gesture, a small one. The kind a person makes when straightening a collar before a meeting they consider routine. Earth's transit lane access, he said, in the polite murmur that never seemed to rise above a comfortable conversation, is hereby terminated. The Sol system is under full Vakari ascendancy quarantine. 12,000 ships, effective immediately. 31 species watched from their tiered seats in the registry chamber and said nothing. Vale watched them not say it. He was third-tier intelligence staff. His job was to read rooms, and what he read in this one was a collective, practiced stillness that 31 species had learned over many decades of Vakari lane control. It was not agreement. It was arithmetic. They expected Earth to flood the channels with pleas. Every projection said so. Vale had written 3 of those projections himself. Earth turned off its transmitters. Stay close. This part, the silence after, is the part that matters. 6 hours before the MedHub strike, Vale had been processing routine spectral data in the secondary analytics bay when his terminal flagged an anomaly on the Sol boundary scanners. A minor fluctuation. He logged it, noted it for the morning shift, and went to get a cup of cooling fluid from the dispenser in the corridor. He did not go back to look at it. That small failure would occupy a specific corridor of his memory for a long time afterward. 3 days before the broadcast, the outer perimeter pickets, 47 light Vakari patrol craft stationed in rotating arcs around the blockade's far edge, had filed their last scheduled position reports. Nothing in those reports was unusual. Course corrections, standard fuel metrics, 2 minor equipment flags that maintenance had already logged for the next resupply rotation. Vale had initialed the summary himself. 47 ships, all accounted for. After the broadcast, not one of them checked in again. Vale noted this. He flagged it through the proper channel. The flag sat in a queue behind the administrative documentation of the quarantine order, which required 17 distinct registry filings and the formal signature of the Fleet Overseer's senior adjutant. That adjutant was busy. The queue was patient. In the registry chamber, the declaration was clean, precise, and brief. Zyla Voss did not gloat. Vale had worked in Vakari intelligence long enough to understand that gloating required a kind of emotional investment the Overseer simply did not have in this outcome. Earth was not an enemy. It was a logistical problem being resolved. A dependent species that had, briefly and inconveniently, refused to continue depending. The resource-dependent client races, Zyla Voss had said, and Vale had later pulled the transcript to verify the exact phrasing, cannot innovate outside approved supply vectors. They will wither without our supply lines. We merely have to wait for the silence. He had said it the way a technician describes a cooling system, factually, without heat. The 31 species in the chamber did not object. Their trade lanes ran through Vakari checkpoints. Their fuel depots sat in Vakari-administered sectors. Their silence was not cowardice. It was, again, arithmetic. Vale filed his picket flag through proper channels and watched the broadcast end. 21 standard rotations passed. No breakout attempt. No refugee ships punching through the blockade perimeter in desperate sprints toward neutral sectors. No diplomatic couriers. No encrypted burst transmissions to allied species. The monitoring arrays would have caught those. Nothing. The silence from Earth was so complete that Vale began running diagnostics on the monitoring equipment, certain something had failed. The equipment had not failed. Earth had simply gone quiet in a way that did not match any behavioral model in the intelligence archive. He pulled the relevant section of the Vakari xenobiology database. Human Homo sapiens dependency profile. High. External supply reliance. Critical. Psychological stress response under isolation. Panic threshold reached at approximately 15 standard rotations. 21 rotations. Nothing. On rotation 18, Xylovos had walked through the analytics bay where Vale worked, paused at the Sol monitoring display, the flat, clean absence of signal from an entire planet, and smiled. It was a symmetrical smile. It touched both sides of his face at precisely equal intervals. Dignity, the overseer said, without looking away from the dark display. Even the prey species develop a version of it. He walked on. Vale watched his secondary optical ridges flutter in the reflection of the dark terminal screen and said nothing. On rotation 22, the courier probe arrived. It came from the direction of Earth's L2 point, drifting on a ballistic course that suggested it had been launched with minimal propulsion. No active drive signature. No encrypted handshake. It moved through the blockade perimeter at the speed of a thrown object, and the Vakari interception array caught it with a tractor beam the way one catches something dropped by accident. The probe was small, old design by the look of the hull plating. The kind of fabrication method humanity had been using for a century before the Ascendancy's transit agreements had given them access to better manufacturing lanes. Vale was in the secondary analytics bay when the deck officer sent the contents report to all senior intelligence staff. He read it twice. The probe contained one object. A shipping manifest machined from solid titanium. Heavy, the size of a standard data slate, but the weight of something meant to last. No digital component, no transmitter, physical text pressed into the metal surface. Delivery confirmed. Manifest, titanium plate stock. Quantity adequate. Recipient, VOKARI Ascendancy. Payment, complements of the Sol system. Below the text, a set of physical coordinates, deep in the Jovian debris ring. The outer edge of the blockade perimeter. Vale stared at the coordinates. His secondary optical ridges began to flutter. The overseer's reaction to the manifest was, in its own way, a piece of data. Xylovos held the titanium slate in both hands for 11 seconds. Vale counted, turning it over once, reading the pressed text, reading it again. Then he set it on the command deck railing with the deliberate care of someone placing a child's drawing in a polite location rather than discarding it in front of witnesses. Starvation-induced delirium, he said, presents across most carbon-based species as a phase of resource fixation. They imagine transactions, commerce, normalcy. He straightened his adamantine crest with 2 fingers. File it. The deck officer filed it. Vale picked up the slate after the overseer left the command deck. He turned it over. The titanium was machined to a tolerance that suggested equipment of real precision, not the rough output of a desperate, improvised fabrication run. Someone had taken time with this. Someone had access to tooling that worked. He carried it to the mass spectrometer lab in the lower analytics tier and set it in the reader. He told himself he was being thorough. It was his job to be thorough. The analysis would take 40 minutes. He went back to his desk, straightened his terminal, and pulled up the pending queue for the outer picket flag he had filed on rotation 3. The flag had moved. It was now 4th from the top. He stared at the queue for a moment, then reached for his cooling fluid and found the cup empty. He got up to refill it. The spectrometer rang quietly in the lab below. On the Sol monitoring display, the same display the overseer had smiled at on rotation 18, nothing had changed. The flat, clean absence of signal persisted. An entire civilization sitting behind a wall of 12,000 ships and making no sound that the arrays could find. The Galactic Registry Chamber had formally accepted the quarantine declaration on rotation 1. 31 species had abstained from the procedural vote rather than object, which the Vakari administrative apparatus recorded as unanimous concurrence. The record now showed that the Sol system's restricted status had galactic institutional backing, which meant that any species that broke the blockade for humanitarian transit would be doing so against the registered will of the Chamber itself. The Chamber's certainty, in other words, was now on the record. It was sitting there, in the permanent registry file, documented. Vale refilled his cooling fluid and walked back toward the lab. The spectrometer was still running. He sat at his desk and pulled up the outer picket queue again, and this time he did not look at the position in line. He looked at the last confirmed position report from the 47 ships, the one he had initialed himself, 3 days before the broadcast. He found the patrol arc, the rotating coverage pattern, the sector coordinates. He looked at the coordinates on the titanium manifest, which he had written down from memory before carrying the slate downstairs. They were not the same coordinates, but they were in the same region of the Jovian debris ring. Vale's secondary optical ridges began to flutter again, and this time they did not stop. The spectrometer result came back in 38 minutes. Vale was at his desk when the terminal chimed. He had spent the intervening time pulling the outer picket logs again, not the summary he had initialed, but the raw position data, rotation by rotation, going back 40 days. He had arranged the coordinates in a column and was staring at the gap where the last entry stopped when the chime pulled his attention to the lab terminal feed. He walked downstairs. The result was displayed in 3 lines: elemental composition, isotopic ratios, source classification. The titanium in the manifest matched Vakari stealth plating alloy to a confidence interval that the machine flagged as near certain. Not similar, not adjacent on the periodic profile. The same alloy. The same isotopic signature that the Ascendancy's foundries had been producing for 11 years, using a trace element blend specific enough that independent replication was considered industrially impossible without access to Vakari or processing facilities. Vale stood in front of the display for a long time. Then he walked back upstairs and sat at his desk and looked at his column of picket coordinates. 47 ships, last confirmed position, the outer debris arc, rotating coverage, standard patrol. That had been 3 days before the broadcast. Then nothing, no distress signals, no automated collision alerts, no fuel depletion warnings, which the older patrol craft were prone to sending unprompted when their tanks dropped below 30%. Just a gap in the column where the data stopped. He pulled up the Sol monitoring display. Flat, silent, an entire planet with its transmitters off and its surface dark to the arrays. He thought about the coordinates on the manifest, deep in the Jovian debris ring, the outer blockade edge, right where the patrol arc used to be. He thought about what humanity would need to machine a Vakari alloy titanium document, what they would need to obtain that alloy in the first place, what was available in the outer blockade perimeter that they could reach, given that the inner perimeter was sealed and watched. The answer arrived without ceremony. He sat very still. His first instinct was to go directly to the overseer. His second instinct, which arrived about 4 seconds later and proved stronger, was to verify. He was an intelligence analyst. Verification was not optional. If he walked into the overseer's command deck with a theory built on a spectrometer result and a column of missing position reports, and the theory turned out to be wrong, that was the kind of error that ended careers in Vakari intelligence. More specifically, it ended the career's owner. So Vale pulled the full sensor sweep logs for the outer debris arc. Not the summary, not the processed report, but the raw array data, which ran to several thousand entries per rotation, and which nobody in the analytics division had looked at directly in years, because the processing algorithms were supposed to flag anything worth seeing. He filtered for mass displacement events, objects moving that weren't logged as moving. The algorithm had not flagged anything. The raw data disagreed. It took him 6 rotations of work, 6 straight shifts at his terminal, cooling fluid going cold beside him, his secondary optical ridges twitching at irregular intervals, to find the pattern. It was subtle, deliberate. Whatever was moving in the outer arc was moving in the seams between sensor refresh cycles, using the debris field's natural scatter to mask displacement signatures. Something had been moving out there for 19 days. Small objects, many of them, following the patrol arc's last logged positions exactly in the correct rotational sequence, as though someone had studied the coverage pattern and understood precisely where the pickets had been and when the sensor refresh window was open. As though someone had learned the pattern from the pickets themselves. Vale stopped the playback at rotation 12 and stared at the screen. The objects were not moving randomly through the debris field. They were moving from a fixed source point, the coordinates on the titanium manifest, outward in organized distribution arcs toward the inner blockade line. Toward the dreadnoughts. He counted the distribution arcs. He lost count after several hundred. Vale's report took him 4 hours to write. Not because the findings were complicated to express. They weren't. But because he rewrote the summary section 11 times, trying to find language that was precise without being the kind of precise that made a senior Vicari officer feel that an intelligence analyst had just told him something he should have known already. The final version ran to 9 pages. He flagged it Priority 1, which meant it would reach the overseer within 2 standard hours. He sent it. Then he sat at his desk and did something he had not done in a long time. He simply waited. The cooling fluid had been empty for 4 hours. He did not get up to refill it. On the Sol monitoring display across the room, nothing had changed. The flat absence of signal that had sat there for 22 rotations continued to sit there, unchanged, like a held breath that showed no sign of needing to release. Vale thought about Director Cassia Roa. He had pulled her file on rotation 4 as part of routine intelligence profiling on Earth's senior logistics administration. She was the head of Deep Space Supply Coordination, not a military role, officially. Her background was infrastructure, transit routing, the movement of material between the Sol system's orbital stations and its outer installations. She had spent 16 years building the supply architecture for the Tethys generational med hubs before the Ascendancy's lane agreements had absorbed most of that work into the approved transit network. The file had a note in it that Vale had flagged at the time and then not followed up on because it seemed minor. Roa had continued running parallel logistics infrastructure alongside the approved Vicari supply chain, not instead of it, alongside it. Independent routing, independent material tracking, independent storage distribution. Her own parallel system, maintained quietly for 16 years at what must have been considerable cost, while the official system handled most of the volume. The intelligence note had categorized this as inefficiency, redundancy for its own sake, the behavior of a bureaucrat who didn't trust systems she hadn't built herself. Vale was no longer certain that was the right category. He looked at the Sol monitoring display. He thought about what it meant to spend 16 years building a logistics system that nobody knew you had, running quiet in parallel with the one everyone could see. He thought about 22 rotations of silence from a planet that was supposedly dying. He thought about hundreds of small objects moving through a debris field in organized arcs toward 12,000 dreadnoughts, following patrol patterns that only the outer pickets would have known, carrying hull material that had the isotopic signature of those same pickets. His secondary optical ridges were still now. They had gone still about an hour into the report writing and hadn't moved since. He had come to understand, in his years of self-observation, that they fluttered when he was processing a contradiction and went still when he had resolved it into a certainty he didn't want. He had resolved it. The question was no longer what humanity was doing. The question was how far along they were. The priority one flag on his report reached the overseer's senior adjutant in 1 hour and 40 minutes. The senior adjutant reviewed the flag designation, checked the queue, and noted that the overseer was currently in a formal address to the registry chamber's secondary committee, a scheduled briefing on the Sol quarantine's projected timeline, during which interruptions were not standard procedure. The adjutant logged the report as received and placed it in the post-briefing review queue. Vale did not know this yet. He was still at his desk. At some point in the 4 hours since he had sent the report, a small thing had happened that he had barely registered at the time. His terminal had shown a brief sensor ping from the outer debris arc, not a movement event, not a mass displacement, just a return signal from a routine array sweep, the kind that happened automatically every 6 hours and usually showed nothing but rock and ice. This one had shown a brief thermal trace, small, the kind of heat signature produced by a piece of equipment that had just been powered down. It had lasted 0.4 seconds and then disappeared. The processing algorithm had not flagged it. Vale had written it into the report's appendix, on page 9, under a subheading labeled Additional Anomalies, Low Confidence. He was beginning to think it deserved a different heading. On the Sol monitoring display, something changed. Not a transmission, not a signal the monitoring arrays were designed to catch. The change was in a secondary metric that Vale had been watching almost without thinking about it, the passive thermal return from Earth's orbital space, the aggregate warmth of a planet's activity, manufacturing, power generation, the background radiation of a civilization maintaining itself. For 22 rotations, that thermal return had been consistent. Low. Lower than baseline, in fact, which fit the model of a population under resource stress, reduced industrial output, reduced power draw. At rotation 22.4, it dropped. Not by much, a fraction of a percent, the kind of change that showed up as a rounding difference in the automated reports. But the direction was wrong. Under resource stress, thermal return decreased gradually and then stabilized as a civilization rationed. It did not drop sharply at a specific moment. Sharp drops indicated a rapid shift in activity, something powering down all at once, or something that had been drawing power in one location stopping because it had moved. Vale was staring at this when his terminal chimed. Not the priority one response from the overseer's office. A different chime, an automated alert from the outer array, which had just completed its 6-hour passive sweep. The thermal trace in the outer debris arc had returned. Not 0.4 seconds this time. Steady, sustained, hundreds of sources spread across the full arc of the outer blockade perimeter. And they were moving inward. Vale stood up. He reached the overseer's command deck in 4 minutes, moving at a pace that was technically not running. Vakari intelligence staff did not run in corridors as a matter of professional standard, but which covered the distance at a speed that running would also have covered. The overseer was not there. The secondary committee briefing was still in session. The deck officer on duty looked up from her station with the particular expression of someone who was about to explain that she could not interrupt the briefing. Vale set his terminal on her console, open to the outer array alert. She looked at it. She looked up at him. She reached for the command deck intercom. The thing Vale kept coming back to later was the manifest. They had sent it early, rotation 22, before the drones had completed their inward approach, before the final stage was ready. They had sent a physical piece of machined metal through 12,000 ships and a tractor beam on a ballistic course that guaranteed retrieval, knowing it would be analyzed. They had wanted the Vakari to analyze it. Not to warn them, not to gloat, There was no mechanism by which the spectrometer result, or the coordinate notation, or the text itself could have done anything to stop what was already in motion. The outer perimeter pickets had been gone for 19 days. Whatever was coming had been in preparation for longer than the manifest had been in transit. They had sent the receipt after the work was done, not because it would change anything, because they wanted it on the record. Director Cassia Roa had spent 16 years building a logistics system in parallel with the one everyone could see. She understood documentation. She understood that the permanent record of the Galactic Registry Chamber was exactly that, permanent. And she had put her delivery confirmation into it before the delivery was finished, which meant that when the registry's next audit cycle ran, the timestamp would show that humanity had filed its manifest before the Vakari fleet knew what it was a manifest for. The record would show it in that order, forever. Vale was thinking about this as the command deck intercom opened, and the deck officer, in a calm and level voice that nonetheless carried something underneath it, asked the overseer to return to the primary deck at his earliest convenience. Vale looked at the outer array feed on his terminal. The thermal traces were still moving inward. Hundreds of them. His secondary optical ridges had not moved in 2 hours. The intercom clicked off, and the command deck went quiet. Vale set his terminal on the duty console and pulled up the outer array feed at full resolution. What had been hundreds of thermal traces an hour ago was now a continuous spread, a field of moving heat sources, small and evenly distributed, filling the sensor return the way iron filings fill in around a magnet. Organized, deliberate, not the random scatter of debris pushed by gravitational drift, but a pattern that only made sense if you knew what you were looking at. He knew what he was looking at. The deck officer, whose name was Pravincel and who had been stationed on the Citadel for 6 years without incident, was watching the same feed. Her hands were flat on the console. She had stopped reaching for controls. "How long," she said, not quite asking him, "before inner perimeter sensors pick them up?" Vale ran the math. Approach speed from the outer arc, estimated mass displacement per unit, standard inner array refresh interval. "They already have," he said. "The algorithm didn't flag it." Pravincel looked at him. "The same algorithm," he said, "that didn't flag the outer arc for 19 days. She turned back to the console and started pulling the inner perimeter raw data manually, the same way Vale had done for the outer arc. Her hands were moving fast. Vale watched the thermal field on his terminal. The sources were close enough now that the array was resolving individual return signatures. He could see the spacing between them. He could see the way they had positioned themselves relative to the dreadnoughts in the inner line, not behind the hulls, not in the direct sensor shadow, but offset, placed in the specific angular gaps where one ship's array coverage ended and the next one's began. The gaps left by 47 missing pickets. They had mapped the coverage holes. They had used the pickets to map them. Xylavos came through the command deck entrance at a pace that was not running, but that carried the particular energy of a person who had been interrupted and was managing their response to that interruption. His adamantine command crest was straight. His expression was the symmetrical neutral that Vale had learned over 3 years of working in the overseer's orbit, meant he was processing something he had not expected. He looked at the main display. He looked at Vale. "Your report," he said, "identifies a spectrometer match and a sequence of missing position returns." "Yes, Overseer. And your interpretation of that data is that humanity has been harvesting the outer blockade perimeter for 19 days, Vale said, and that the material products of that harvest are currently approaching the inner line. Xylavos crossed to the main display. He studied the thermal field. He was quiet for long enough that Pravincel glanced up from the raw data she was pulling and then looked back down. "The resource-dependent client races," the overseer said, in the same polite murmur he had used in the registry chamber, "do not have the industrial capacity to process reclaimed hull material at operational speed. Not under blockade conditions. Not without approved manufacturing access. No, Overseer, Vale said. They don't. He let that sit. Xylavos looked at the display. The thermal field was still expanding, still organized, still moving in the arcs that matched the inner dreadnought positions. They would need, the Overseer said slowly, pre-positioned fabrication infrastructure, outside the approved supply network. Director Roa ran parallel logistics infrastructure alongside the approved Vakari transit system for 16 years, Vale said. Independent routing, independent storage. She maintained it at her own cost while the official network handled the primary volume. A silence. We categorized it as redundancy, Xylavos said. Yes, Overseer. The Overseer straightened his adamantine crest with 2 fingers. The first inner perimeter alert came 6 minutes later. Not from the automatic systems. Pravincel found it in the raw data, a contact return from the array positioned between Dreadnought 7 and 8 in the inner line. Small, stationary, pressed flat against the hull of Dreadnought 7 in a position that the primary sensor sweep wouldn't catch unless you were looking at the gap angle specifically. She found 3 more in the next 4 minutes, all in hull gap positions, all stationary, all showing the same low thermal signature, machinery at rest, not active, drawing minimal power. Waiting. Vale pulled Director Roa's file again. The note he had flagged on rotation 4 and not followed up on. 16 years of parallel infrastructure. He scrolled past the logistics data to the personnel section. Her background was supply coordination. Before that, orbital construction oversight. Before that, and this was the part he had not read carefully enough because it had seemed irrelevant to the quarantine situation. She had spent 4 years as a materials recovery specialist during the early phase of Sol system colonization, before the Vakari Lane agreements had made external supply reliable, before there was an approved network to plug into. She had spent 4 years learning how to recover, process, and reuse structural material from damaged or decommissioned orbital infrastructure, in conditions where external resupply was not an option. Vale had a very clear understanding, now, of why she had kept running her parallel system. It was not redundancy. It was practice. He found the contact returns himself on the inner perimeter data. Not 3, not 4, but a full distribution across the dreadnought positions in his sector of the array coverage. He stopped counting individual contacts and started counting the gaps between them. There were no gaps. Every hull face on every ship in the inner line that had an angular blind spot, created by the absence of the outer pickets, had a contact in it. The contacts had been placed before the drones reached inner perimeter sensor range. They had come through the gap in the outer coverage, while the outer coverage gap still existed, before the array could see them and settled into position against the hulls. They had not been approaching the inner line. They had already been there. The movement on the outer arc, the thermal field expanding inward, was a second wave. Vale set his terminal on the console very carefully and looked at the Overseer, who was still studying the main display, still in the polite murmur register of a person managing an unexpected variable. Overseer, Vale said, the contacts on the inner perimeter, they were already in position. What we are seeing on the outer arc is not the approach. It is the signal that the approach is complete. Xylavos turned from the display. For the first time in 3 years of working in the Overseer's orbit, Vale saw him go very still in a way that was different from composure. The Overseer moved to the communications console and keyed the fleet-wide address channel. All inner perimeter commands, he said, in a voice that had not changed in register at all, which was somehow worse than if it had. Conduct immediate external hull sweeps. Manual optical confirmation. Report directly to Fleet Command. The channel opened to 12,000 ships. The reports came back over the next 11 minutes. Vale stood at the main display and watched the fleet-wide response grid, ship by ship, sectors lighting as the manual sweeps ran. The grid was a standard tactical tool, green for clear, amber for inconclusive, red for confirmed contact. The first red appeared at 4 minutes, a dreadnought on the far end of the inner arc, then 3 more, then a cluster. Then the grid stopped showing individual ships and started showing something that took Vale a moment to process because his mind kept trying to make it mean something else. Almost every ship in the fleet had a contact. Not all of them. A few in the center of the formation had come back clean, likely because they were positioned in the inner coverage zones where the picket gaps hadn't created blind spots. But the outer curve of the formation, the bulk of 12,000 ships, was lit red from one end of the tactical grid to the other. Xylavos was looking at the grid. He did not reach for the crest. "How long have they been in position?" he asked, and for the first time the murmur carried something underneath it. "At minimum," Vale said, "since rotation 12. 10 days. They had been sitting against the hulls for 10 days. Pravincel had gone very still at her console. She had stopped pulling data. Here is what Vale understood, standing in front of the grid. The Vakari Ascendancy's blockade of the Sol system rested on a specific logic, that a species dependent on external supply chains could not innovate under deprivation. That isolation equaled starvation, and starvation equaled submission. It was a logic that had worked, with minor variation, on every client species the Ascendancy had ever applied it to. What the Ascendancy had never modeled, what its entire xenobiology database had filed under redundancy and inefficiency and dependency profile. High was a species that had not started with external supply chains. Humanity had reached orbital capacity through localized resource recovery. They had built their first stations from reclaimed material. They had spent their early expansion period learning, in the specific and practical sense, how to treat a debris field as a warehouse. The Vakari blockade had not been a cage. It had been a delivery. On the main display, the outer thermal field had stopped moving. Every source had gone stationary. The whole field, hundreds of contacts across the outer arc and the inner hull faces, held at rest simultaneously, as though waiting for a signal. Vale looked at the timestamp on his terminal. Rotation 22.7. He thought about the titanium manifest, the coordinates, the text, delivery confirmed. He thought about the timestamp on the permanent registry record, filed at rotation 22.2.2, before the outer array had picked up the sustained thermal traces, before Pravincel had called the overseer back to the deck, before the fleet-wide hull sweep had lit the grid red from end to end. The manifest had been time-stamped before all of it. They had filed the receipt before the Vakari knew they'd been robbed. Vale set his terminal down on the console. A low sound moved through the hull of the Citadel. Not an impact, not a collision, something more structural, a vibration in the range that large machinery makes when it changes state. Not starting, not stopping, changing. Pravincel looked up. "That," Vale said, very quietly, "is a resonant frequency tether engaging against the hull." She looked at him. "Against every hull," he said. The grid on the main display was still entirely red. The tactical feed from the inner perimeter ships began going grey, one by one, from the outer curve inward, in the smooth and unhurried sequence of a system shutting down in order. Xylavos was watching the grey spread across 12,000 ships. His hand was at his crest, but he was not touching it. The grey spread across the tactical grid in silence. No alarms, no klaxons cutting through the Citadel's corridors. The fleet-wide alert system required a command authorization to activate, and Xylavos had not given that authorization, and Vale understood, watching the overseer watch the grid, that this was not an oversight. The overseer was still in the register of a person managing a situation. He had simply not yet recalibrated what kind of situation this was. Ship by ship, outer curve to inner line. grey replacing the tactical green of active drives and weapons-ready status, in the smooth and unhurried sequence of something that had been planned to move in exactly this order. Provincelle counted under her breath. Vale heard her stop. "Primary drives," she said. "They're hitting primary drives first, then the firing matrices." She was right. The grey had two shades, now that Vale looked at it, a slightly darker tone that indicated propulsion loss, and a lighter one for weapons systems going offline. The darker grey was spreading faster. Whoever had programmed the drones had prioritized the drives. The fleet would lose movement before it lost weapons, which meant the weapons loss was almost incidental. A ship with no drives was already contained. Xylavos touched his crest. It was not the small two-finger adjustment he used as punctuation. It was a full grip, both hands, the way a person holds something that is the only solid thing available. "Broadcast to the registry chamber," he said. "Open the emergency address channel." Provincelle looked at the communications console. Then she looked at Vale. "The primary drive array handles the broadcast uplink," she said, very quietly. "It runs off the same power trunk as the main propulsion system." A pause. "When did we lose primary drives on the Citadel?" Xylavos asked. "4 minutes ago, Overseer," Provincelle said. "The contact on our hull was in the aft sensor gap. I found it in the raw sweep. I didn't," she stopped. "I should have flagged it first." The command deck was very quiet. The Citadel was the flagship. It had been the first ship in the tactical grid to go fully grey. Vale walked to the starboard observation port and looked out at the Jovian debris ring. What he saw was the thing he would spend a long time trying to describe accurately afterward and would never quite manage. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't, in any visual sense. The dreadnoughts in the nearest arc of the inner line simply sat as they had always sat, vast and dark against the debris field's scattered light. Nothing was on fire. Nothing was tumbling. No escape pods were launching. They were just ships that didn't move anymore. And drifting between them, visible now that he knew to look for them, were the salvage drones. Small, irregular in shape, because they had been built from reclaimed material rather than manufactured to spec. Each one was attached to a specific point on a specific hull, the junction where, according to the spectrometer data Vale had pulled while writing his report, the warp core coupling met the primary drive conduit. They were not weapons. They were tools, wrenches, essentially, built to one purpose. The fleet of 12,000 ships, the largest single military force in Ascendancy history, had been quietly taken apart at its joints. Vale thought about Director Roa reviewing catastrophe reports. He thought about her tapping a stylus in the logistics bay while the blockade sat around her planet. He thought about 16 years of parallel infrastructure, maintained at considerable cost, for a scenario that the Vakari had never modeled because they had decided in advance that it was impossible. The impossible had taken 22 rotations. The backup communications array, which ran off a separate power trunk, because the Citadel's designers had understood that a flagship losing its main broadcast capability was a scenario worth planning for, came online 4 minutes after the primary went down. Xylavos moved to the backup console. He set his hands on it. He did not key the transmit control. Vale watched him. There was nothing to transmit that would change what was happening in the debris ring. The drones had already completed their primary task. The tactical grid was almost entirely grey. Any command he broadcast to the fleet would reach ships that could not execute it. The Overseer understood this. Vale could see him understanding it. He reached for his cooling fluid, a habit Vale had observed over 3 years that he fell back on when processing, and found the cup on the command deck railing where he had set it 20 minutes ago. It was cold. He held it without drinking. Then he keyed the backup transmitter to the registry chamber emergency channel. The registry chamber's main display lit up across 31 species. The feed showed the Jovian debris ring, the tactical grid overlay, the grey. Vale knew this because the chamber's secondary monitoring array, which fed its display from the blockade's own sensor net, was still active. It had never run off the Citadel's primary power trunk. It ran off the ring's automated infrastructure, which had been here before the Citadel arrived and would be here after. Director Cassia Roa had sent the manifest before the tethers engaged. The manifest's timestamp was in the registry chamber's permanent file. The live feed of the neutered fleet was now also in the registry chamber's permanent file. The chamber had a complete record of both things, in order, and the 31 species watching the display could do the arithmetic themselves. She appeared on the chamber hologram at rotation 22.9. No preamble, no formal request for floor access, though Vale would check the registry transcript later and find that she had filed the access request at rotation 22.1, before the outer array had picked up the sustained thermal traces, before Pravincel had called the overseer back to the deck. She had filed for floor access before Vale had sent his priority 1 report. Director Cassia Roa materialized in the chamber hologram wearing a plain civilian suit, the kind a logistics coordinator wears to an administrative review. No insignia, no formal dress. She was holding a data slate in her right hand, and with her left, she reached for the small cup of water on the presenter's ledge. She poured a half measure, the absent motion of someone at a desk doing something routine while thinking about the next item, and set the cup back without drinking from it. Then she looked up at the chamber. "I have a filing," she said. Her voice was level, not loud, the kind of voice that carries because the room has gone quiet, not because it is raised. "The names of the Tethys generational medical casualties," she said. "All of them. The registry will receive the permanent record." She read the names. She read them in the order they appeared in the casualty roster, not alphabetical, not by role or species or sector assignment, but in the order they had been on station when the strike hit, the order they had been standing in their work: medical staff, patients, support crews, the morning rotation that had not yet been relieved, the overnight staff that had stayed past shift end. 1.8 million names. He did not read all of them aloud, because the registry did not require verbal recitation. The data slate's filing transferred the full record the moment she confirmed the submission. But she read a portion, long enough that the registry chamber, which had formally accepted the quarantine declaration without objection, sat and listened to names while the feed of the neutered fleet rotated slowly in the Jovian debris ring behind her hologram. No one interrupted. When she stopped reading, she set the data slate on the presenter's ledge. She did not pick it up again. "The Vakari Ascendancy's transit monopoly," she said, "is dissolved as of this record entry. The Sol system assumes administrative oversight of the contested lane network, effective immediately under the authority established by the registry's own dependency suppression protocols, the ones the Ascendancy used to justify the quarantine." She paused. One beat. The same authority, applied in the same direction. A long silence in the chamber. Vale was watching the backup feed on the command deck. He could see the 31 species in their tiered seats. He could not read their expressions at this resolution, but he could see that none of them had moved. "The registry record," Roa said, "will show that the Vakari Ascendancy filed for quarantine authority at rotation 1 of this cycle. It will also show that the quarantine produced the conditions for the contested lanes to change hands. Both facts, in order. The registry can draw its own conclusions." She looked directly at the feed point that corresponded to the Citadel's backup transmitter. "You believed you were sealing a tomb, Overseer," she said. "We just appreciated the privacy while we unbolted your fleet." She stepped back from the presenter's ledge. The hologram didn't cut. It held her there, in the plain civilian suit, in front of the slow rotation of 12,000 drifting ships. On the Citadel's command deck, Xylivos set the cold cup of cooling fluid back on the railing. He straightened his adamantine crest with 2 fingers. It was the same small gesture he had made in the registry chamber when he had terminated Earth's transit access and declared humanity a closed account. The same adjustment, the same two fingers, the same unhurried motion. But Vale had spent 3 years reading rooms, and what he read in this one was not composure. The Citadel's drives were offline. The backup transmitter could receive, but its broadcast range was limited to in-ring channels. The registry chamber feed was incoming, not outgoing. Xylovos could watch the chamber display. He could not address it. The dreadnoughts in the outer arc were drifting on their last logged heading, which had been a holding pattern around the Sol system perimeter. They would continue to drift on that heading, very slowly, until someone came to tow them. They were not going anywhere under their own power. Their life support systems were intact. The drones had been precise about what they uncoupled and what they left alone. The crews were not in danger. They were simply not going anywhere. The Overseer's command crest caught the light from the observation port as he adjusted it. For a moment, the adamantine surface threw a small reflection across the tactical grid, a bright point moving over the grey field of 12,000 neutralized ships. Then he lowered his hands and looked at the display and said nothing. The titanium manifest was still on the command deck railing where the deck officer had filed it 6 hours ago, after the Overseer had set it there. Vale picked it up. The machining was precise. He had noted this in the lab when he had first felt the weight of it before carrying it to the spectrometer. But he noticed it differently now, not the precision of a desperate fabrication run, but the precision of a workshop that had been running for a long time, quietly, in parallel with the systems everyone could see. The same workshop that had been building drones from reclaimed hull plating for 19 days, and had produced enough of them to reach every ship in a 12,000-vessel fleet. The coordinates pressed into the metal were the outer debris arc. The patrol region, where 47 pickets had filed their last position, reports 3 days before the broadcast. The manifest read, "Delivery confirmed." Vale turned it over. The back was smooth, unmarked. But at the bottom edge, where the machining had been finished, there was a small mark in the metal, not pressed text, not a stamp, a tool mark, the kind left by the last pass of a cutting instrument against the alloy. The kind of mark you only noticed if you were holding the object at the right angle in the right light. It was not deliberate. It was just what the process left behind when you built something real. He set the manifest back on the railing. From the observation port, the debris ring was still. The drones had powered down after the tether sequences completed. Their thermal signatures had dropped to ambient on the outer array feed, while Roa was reading the names. They sat against the dreadnought hulls in the hull gap positions, the specific angular blind spots created by the absence of the pickets. The pickets that the Ascendancy had sent to surround a planet, it had decided, could not fight back. The 31 species in the registry chamber were still in their seats. The live feed was still running. The chamber's permanent record was adding entries in real time. The casualty roster, the transit monopoly dissolution, the floor access timestamp, the manifest filing from rotation 22.2. All of it in order. The feed of the debris ring rotated slowly in the background of the chamber display. The dreadnoughts turned on their last headings, unhurried, going nowhere. Somewhere behind the blockade perimeter, behind the 12,000 ships that were no longer a blockade, a planet had not transmitted a single signal in 22 rotations. It still wasn't transmitting. It didn't need to. The record was speaking.